Corporal Jake Morrison had gotten used to being the smallest guy in any room, but the briefing hall of Forward Operating Base Kepler 9 made him feel like a child who'd wandered into a convention of professional wrestlers. Around him sat the finest specimens that 4 different alien species could produce: Vorthak warriors whose skin looked like living armor plating, Zephyrian scouts whose enhanced reflexes made them blur when they moved, and Gromnite heavy infantry who could probably use Jake as a projectile weapon if they got creative. "The package is a priority diplomatic envoy," Colonel Thorne announced, activating the holographic display that showed their new assignment. Etherian species, telepathic capabilities, absolutely critical to the peace negotiations with the indigenous populations. Jake studied the mission parameters on his tactical display, noting details that his enhanced pattern recognition training helped him process faster than his alien teammates could appreciate. The Etherians were known throughout the galaxy as peaceful scholars whose advanced civilization had transcended warfare through technology and social evolution. Sending one to a frontier combat zone was like asking a librarian to referee a cage match. "Her name is Lyssa Telandris," the colonel continued as the hologram shifted to show their assignment. 26 standard years old, specialized in interspecies diplomatic protocols, and apparently the first of her people to volunteer for field assignment in a potential combat zone. Jake found himself staring at the image with professional assessment that had nothing to do with the obvious physical beauty that made several of his teammates lean forward with interest. Lyssa appeared delicate in a way that beings from peaceful worlds often did. Elegant pointed ears, features that suggested generations of evolution in safe environments, and clothing that prioritized comfort and functionality over protective capability. "She looks fragile," rumbled Sergeant Kozak, a Vorthak whose scars told stories of encounters with things that specialized in making large beings significantly smaller. "Why send someone like that to a zone where the local wildlife considers anything under 300 kilograms to be a snack?" "Because," Colonel Thorne replied with the patience of someone who'd learned to work with interspecies military personalities, "her telepathic abilities make her uniquely qualified to establish communication with indigenous populations that have resisted all previous contact attempts." The briefing continued with tactical assessments, threat analyses, and logistical considerations that Jake absorbed while studying Lyssa's psychological profile. Brilliant, dedicated, and completely unprepared for environments where violence was a constant possibility. The kind of person who would need protection not just from external threats, but from the psychological trauma of existing in a world where peaceful solutions weren't always available. "Assignment details," Colonel Thorne announced. "Morrison, your primary protection detail." Jake felt every enhanced alien sensory apparatus in the room focus on him with varying degrees of surprise and amusement. At 5 feet 8 inches and 160 pounds, he represented the absolute minimum physical standards for interspecies military service, standards that existed primarily to ensure humans didn't get accidentally stepped on by their larger teammates. "Sir," Lieutenant Vex spoke up, his Zephyrian vocal cords producing harmonics that translated roughly as polite incredulity. "Wouldn't it be more appropriate to assign protection duties to someone with enhanced physical capabilities? Morrison has specialized training in human adaptive tactics and civilian protection protocols," Colonel Thorne replied. "Plus, his psychological profile suggests he'll work well with Etherian sensitivities." "What he means," Corporal Drax added with the blunt honesty that made Gromnite's excellent heavy infantry, "is that Morrison is small enough that the telepath won't feel overwhelmed by aggressive emotional emanations." Jake stood up, drawing attention to his admittedly unimpressive physical presence. "I want to make something clear," he said, his voice carrying the calm confidence that human military training had taught him to project regardless of circumstances. "I will personally ensure Ms. Telandris's safety during this assignment. Whatever threatens her will have to go through me first." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds before Sergeant Kozak started laughing. The sound was like boulders tumbling down a mountainside, and it triggered responses from the other alien soldiers that ranged from amusement to genuine concern for Jake's mental health. "Morrison," Kozak managed between chuckles, "I've seen you struggle to open ration containers that weren't specifically designed for human hand strength. You're going to protect a telepathic diplomat from indigenous predators that hunt in packs and consider Vorthak warriors to be moderately challenging prey?" With respect, Sergeant, Jake replied evenly, I've been underestimated before. It usually works out better for me than for whoever's doing the underestimating. Lieutenant Vex's features shifted in what Jake had learned to recognize as Zephyrian skepticism. Corporal, your dedication is admirable, but protection duties require capabilities that humans simply don't possess. Enhanced reflexes, superior strength, advanced sensory apparatus. What humans possess, Jake interrupted, is adaptability. We don't have the strongest muscles or the fastest reflexes, but we have something that's kept us alive since we evolved on a death world full of predators that were bigger, faster, and stronger than we were. And what's that? Drax asked with genuine curiosity. We're really good at killing things that think they're better than we are. The briefing hall fell quiet again, but this time the silence carried a different quality. Jake could see his teammates processing this statement, their enhanced alien intelligences analyzing human military history and coming to conclusions that their previous amusement had prevented them from considering. Besides, Jake continued, checking his equipment loadout with practiced efficiency, Ms. Telandris is a telepath from a peaceful species. What she needs isn't someone who radiates aggressive confidence. She needs someone who can provide emotional stability while being ready to handle violence when peaceful solutions aren't available. Colonel Thorne nodded approvingly. Morrison understands the assignment parameters. The Etherian delegate arrives in 6 hours. I want protection protocols in place and ready for implementation upon her arrival. As the briefing dispersed, Jake caught fragments of conversation from his teammates that ranged from continuing amusement to grudging respect for his confidence. He didn't particularly care about their opinions. He'd learned long ago that being the smallest person in the room meant proving himself through results rather than rhetoric. 6 hours later, Jake stood at the landing pad watching a diplomatic transport descend through Kepler-9's atmosphere. The ship's elegant design reflected Etherian aesthetic preferences. Flowing lines that suggested organic growth rather than military efficiency, materials that seemed to capture and redirect starlight, and technology that operated with the kind of quiet perfection that came from centuries of peaceful development. When Lyssa Telandris emerged from the transport, Jake's first impression was that she looked even more delicate in person than her holographic image had suggested. But his second impression, based on the way she carried herself and the alert intelligence in her pale green eyes, was that delicate didn't necessarily mean weak. Ms. Telandris, he said, offering what he hoped was a reassuring smile. I'm Corporal Morrison. I'll be responsible for your safety during this assignment. Lyssa looked at him with the kind of careful assessment that suggested her telepathic abilities were providing information beyond what normal senses could detect. You're smaller than I expected, she said quietly. I get that a lot, Jake replied. But I've found that size isn't always the most important factor in protection work. The others, your teammates, they don't believe you can protect me. Jake glanced at his alien squadmates, who were maintaining professional positions while probably sharing private communications about his prospects for keeping a peaceful telepath alive in a combat zone. They'll learn, he said simply. In my experience, the best way to change people's minds about human capabilities is to show them what we can do when someone we care about is in danger. Lyssa's expression shifted slightly, and Jake realized she was reading something in his emotional patterns that surprised her. You already care about protecting me, even though we've just met. It's not personal, Jake said, though he realized as he said it that it wasn't entirely true. I just don't like seeing people get hurt when I could have prevented it. That's more personal than you think, Lyssa replied, and Jake caught a hint of a smile that suggested she found his emotional honesty refreshing after dealing with the complex aggressive confidence that radiated from his teammates. As they walked toward the base facilities, Jake began implementing protection protocols that took advantage of human adaptability rather than trying to compete with alien physical superiority. He might not be the strongest or fastest member of the team, but he was the one who understood that protecting someone meant more than just being ready to fight, it meant creating an environment where they felt safe enough to do their job. And if his alien teammates wanted to keep laughing at his protective instincts, that was fine with him. He'd learned that being underestimated was often the first step toward proving that humans could accomplish things that looked impossible from the outside. 3 days into the mission, Jake had learned that protecting a telepath was like trying to provide security for someone who could feel every aggressive thought, violent impulse, and combat-ready emotion within a 50-meter radius. Lissa spent most briefings looking like she was trying to meditate in the middle of a thunderstorm, her pointed ears twitching unconsciously as she processed the emotional static generated by a dozen different species of professional warriors. The indigenous populations have increased their probe attacks by 30%, Lieutenant Vex reported during the morning tactical assessment. Our perimeter sensors are detecting coordinated movement patterns that suggest intelligence gathering rather than random territorial behavior. Jake watched Lissa's reaction to this news, noting the way her telepathic sensitivity made her flinch slightly every time someone in the briefing room experienced a spike of aggressive anticipation. His alien teammates radiated the kind of eager confidence that came from beings who'd been engineered for combat, but their emotional intensity was clearly overwhelming for someone from a species that had eliminated warfare generations ago. Morrison, Colonel Thorne said, your assessment of civilian protection requirements under increased threat conditions? Ms. Telandris needs a quieter environment for her diplomatic preparations, Jake replied, deliberately keeping his own emotional state calm and steady. The cumulative stress from proximity to combat-ready personnel is interfering with her telepathic focus. Sergeant Kozak's laugh rumbled through the briefing room like distant artillery. The human wants us to tone down our warrior instincts so the telepath doesn't get nervous. What I want, Jake said evenly, is for our diplomatic asset to be functional when we need her to communicate with indigenous populations. Right now, she's spending so much energy filtering combat emotions that she can barely maintain basic telepathic clarity. Perhaps, Lissa said quietly, Corporal Morrison could provide protection detail in a separate area where I could prepare for diplomatic contact without. She paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing. Without being overwhelmed by everyone's enthusiasm for potential combat. The alien soldiers exchanged glances that Jake recognized as the universal military expression for, civilians don't understand how protection works. Lieutenant Vex spoke first, his harmonics carrying patient condescension. Ms. Telandris, effective protection requires maintaining proximity to the protected individual. If Morrison separates you from the main security force, he becomes a single point of failure against threats that would overwhelm any individual soldier. Not necessarily, Jake interjected, pulling up tactical displays on his portable unit. Distributed protection can be more effective than concentrated security when the primary threats are environmental rather than directed assault. Corporal Drax studied Jake's tactical analysis with the methodical attention that Ground Knights applied to anything involving defensive positioning. You're suggesting layered defense with the primary asset positioned in a secure rear area? I'm suggesting that sometimes the best protection is making sure the person you're protecting can actually do their job, Jake replied. Ms. Telandris needs telepathic clarity to establish communication with indigenous populations. That's not going to happen if she's constantly processing the emotional equivalent of a martial arts tournament. Colonel Thorne considered this assessment while studying readouts that showed increasing indigenous activity around their perimeter. Trial implementation. Morrison, establish a secure communication post with Ms. Telandris at grid reference 77 Alpha. Maintain contact with main force and report any changes in threat assessment. As the briefing dispersed, Jake caught the tail end of a conversation between his alien teammates that his enhanced hearing allowed him to overhear despite their attempts at discretion. Putting the civilian at risk by separating her from adequate protection. Morrison's tactical analysis isn't entirely flawed, but his physical limitations. When the real threats show up, he'll be calling for backup within minutes. Jake pretended not to hear these assessments while he gathered equipment for establishing an isolated security position. His teammates weren't wrong about his physical limitations, but they were making the classic mistake of assuming that protection work was primarily about being able to win fights rather than preventing them from happening in the first place. 2 hours later, he and Lissa had established a communication post in a defensible position that provided clear sight lines, multiple escape routes, and most importantly, enough distance from the main force that Lissa's telepathic abilities weren't being overwhelmed by aggressive emotional radiation. This is much better, Lissa said, settling into the portable communication array with obvious relief. I can actually sense the indigenous mental patterns now that I'm not being bombarded by combat anticipation. What are you picking up? Jake asked, maintaining watch on their perimeter while keeping his emotional state as calm and steady as possible. Curiosity, mostly. And caution. They're aware of our presence, but they're not immediately hostile. Lissa paused, her expression growing thoughtful. There's something else, though. Intelligence that's more complex than the briefing material suggested. Jake made notes on his tactical display, correlating Lissa's telepathic observations with sensor data from the main base. Complex how? They're not just monitoring us, they're studying us. Learning our patterns, our capabilities, our responses to different stimuli. Lissa's pointed ears twitched as she concentrated on telepathic signals that Jake couldn't perceive. It feels like they're preparing for something specific. Combat assessment or diplomatic preparation? I'm not sure. The emotions I'm sensing suggest both curiosity and evaluation. Like they're trying to understand what we are before deciding how to interact with us. Jake processed this information while maintaining visual surveillance of their position. Indigenous species that conducted psychological assessment before making contact decisions were significantly more sophisticated than the briefing materials had indicated. That kind of intelligence suggested they were capable of coordinated action that could overwhelm standard military responses. Lissa, he said, using her name instead of formal address for the first time. If these creatures are as intelligent as your telepathic reading suggests, what are the chances they've already figured out our tactical capabilities and developed countermeasures? She was quiet for a moment, her pale green eyes growing distant as she extended her telepathic senses. Jake. I think they've been watching us long enough to understand exactly how each species in our unit fights. The Vorthack charge patterns, the Zephyrian movement techniques, the Gromnite defensive formations. But they haven't had extended observation of human tactical approaches, Jake concluded. Because I've been with the main unit, following standard alien military protocols. Exactly. You're the unknown variable in their assessment. Jake felt pieces of a tactical puzzle clicking into place as he realized that his teammates' dismissive attitude toward human capabilities might actually be a strategic advantage. If the indigenous species had been studying alien military doctrine but hadn't observed human adaptive tactics, then his supposedly inferior abilities could become decisive factors if conflict became unavoidable. Lissa, can you establish communication with them? Not hostile contact, just, let them know we're interested in peaceful interaction. She nodded, settling deeper into the communication array's telepathic amplification field. I'll try. But Jake? Yeah. They're definitely watching us right now. I can feel their attention focused on this position. Jake maintained his calm emotional state while checking his equipment with the practiced efficiency that human military training had burned into his muscle memory. Good. Let them watch. Maybe they'll learn something useful about what humans can do when someone we're protecting needs our help. You're not afraid. I'm terrified, Jake admitted honestly. But being afraid and being ready aren't mutually exclusive. And right now, making sure you can do your job is more important than managing my emotional responses to potential threats. Lissa's expression shifted as her telepathic abilities detected the complex honesty in his emotional patterns, fear balanced by determination, vulnerability paired with protective instincts, and the kind of steady courage that didn't require eliminating doubt to remain functional. Your emotional pattern is unusual, she said quietly. Most of the warriors I've encountered radiate confidence that excludes uncertainty. But you feel both afraid and completely committed to protecting me. Human survival trait, Jake explained while maintaining his surveillance routine. We evolved on a world where the things trying to kill us were usually bigger, faster, and stronger than we were. Being afraid kept us alive, but being paralyzed by fear got us eaten. So we learned to be scared and functional at the same time. And that's why you volunteered to protect me despite what the others said about your physical limitations. Jake considered the question while watching sensor readings that showed increasing indigenous activity around their position. I volunteered because someone needs to make sure you're safe while you try to build bridges between species. And honestly, I'd rather be the one responsible for your protection than leave it to someone who might prioritize proving their combat superiority over keeping you alive. Lissa was quiet for a moment, her telepathic focus shifting between Jake's emotional patterns and the indigenous consciousness she was trying to contact. "They're responding," she said finally. Cautious interest. "They want to understand why a small human is protecting an Etherian telepath instead of larger, stronger aliens." "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That sometimes the best protection comes from understanding rather than strength." Jake smiled despite the tension of knowing they were being observed by potentially hostile indigenous intelligence. "Let's hope they appreciate the philosophical complexity before they decide whether or not to try eating us." The attack came at dawn with the kind of precision that proved the indigenous species had been studying their targets far longer than anyone had realized. Jake's enhanced pattern recognition training woke him 30 seconds before the first explosions, his human intuition detecting something wrong in the ambient sound patterns that his alien teammates' more specialized senses had missed. "Lissa, emergency protocols," he said quietly, reaching for his equipment without making sudden movements that might trigger premature detection. "We're about to have visitors who probably aren't interested in diplomatic conversation." She came awake instantly, her telepathic senses flooding with hostile intent from multiple directions. "Jake, they're everywhere. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. And they're not just attacking, they're executing specific tactical plans designed to counter each species' combat capabilities." The communication array's emergency channel crackled with reports from the main base that confirmed Lissa's telepathic assessment. The indigenous creatures, which intelligence had classified as moderately intelligent pack hunters, were demonstrating coordinated assault tactics that exploited every weakness in standard interspecies military doctrine. "Vortac positions compromised," came Sergeant Kozak's voice over comms, strained with the kind of stress that suggested even enhanced alien warriors could be overwhelmed. "They're using our charge patterns against us, leading us into prepared kill zones." Zephyrian scouts unable to maintain mobility advantage, Lieutenant Vex reported, his harmonics distorted by what sounded like desperate evasive action. "Enemy movement predictions are countering our enhanced reflexes." Corporal Drax's transmission carried the heavy weapons fire that indicated Ground Knight defensive positions were under serious assault. Heavy infantry formations surrounded and isolated. Enemy tactics specifically designed to separate us from mutual support. Jake processed these reports while maintaining watch on their isolated position, his tactical analysis reaching conclusions that made his stomach drop toward his boots. The indigenous species hadn't just been observing their unit, they'd been developing species-specific countermeasures that turned each alien military advantage into a vulnerability. "Lissa, can you reach Colonel Thorne? I need to know if they're following standard evacuation protocols for diplomatic personnel." She concentrated on the communication array's telepathic amplifiers, her expression growing troubled as she made contact with the main base. "Jake, they're not evacuating anyone. The colonel says the position is defensible and they're implementing standard defensive procedures." "Standard procedures won't work against an enemy that's planned counters for standard procedures," Jake replied grimly. "These creatures have studied our people long enough to predict exactly how each species will respond to threats. But not humans. I'm the only human in the unit, and I've been following alien tactical doctrine instead of human adaptive strategies." Jake began implementing protection protocols that had nothing to do with standard military training and everything to do with human survival instincts. "Which means they know how to fight Vortac warriors, Zephyrian scouts, and Ground Knight heavy infantry, but they've never seen what humans do when someone we're protecting is in danger." The first indigenous creatures appeared at the perimeter of their position 60 seconds later, moving with the coordinated precision that marked intelligent pack hunters rather than simple predators. Jake got his first clear look at beings that intelligence reports had drastically underestimated, six-limbed creatures the size of large predatory cats, but with opposable manipulators, obvious tool use, and a kind of tactical coordination that suggested communication methods that human sensors couldn't detect. 12 visible contacts, probably more in concealed positions, Jake reported to Lissa while checking equipment that he'd arranged according to human adaptive principles rather than alien military doctrine. They're studying our position, looking for predictable responses they can counter. What do? We don't give them any predictable responses. Jake activated his personal defense shield, standard equipment that provided moderate protection against projectile weapons and energy attacks. Lissa, I need you to maintain telepathic contact with these creatures if possible. Not for communication, for tactical intelligence. If you can sense their intentions before they act, it gives us an advantage they won't be expecting. The creatures began their approach with the kind of methodical precision that suggested they'd successfully used similar tactics against other defended positions. But Jake had spent 3 days studying their position not according to alien defensive doctrine, but according to human principles of adaptive protection, multiple escape routes, improvised weapons, environmental advantages that could be exploited in unconventional ways. When the first creature reached optimal assault distance, Jake's response wasn't the kind of direct confrontation that his alien teammates would have chosen. Instead, he triggered a series of improvised obstacles. Loose rocks positioned to create unstable footing, reflected light from polished surfaces to disrupt visual targeting, and sound generators that created acoustic confusion in frequency ranges that affected the creature's apparent communication methods. Jake, they're confused, Lissa reported, her telepathic senses detecting emotional responses that the creatures hadn't anticipated. They expected direct defensive action, not environmental manipulation. Humans don't fight fair when someone we care about is in danger, Jake replied, using the confusion he'd created to reposition to a defensive angle that provided better cover while maintaining clear sight lines. We fight to win, which means using every advantage we can create or exploit. The creatures adapted to his initial tactics faster than he'd hoped, but not as quickly as they would have adapted to standard alien military responses. Their coordination remained intact, but their precision suffered when faced with defensive strategies that didn't match their observational data. Jake's second set of improvisations involved turning standard equipment into weapons that no military manual had ever described, communication array components that could generate electromagnetic pulses, portable lighting systems that could create temporary blindness, and structural elements of their position that could be quickly reconfigured to change the tactical geometry of the engagement. Behind you, Lissa warned, her telepathic senses detecting an attack vector that Jake's human perception had missed. He spun, bringing his sidearm to bear on a creature that had approached from a blind spot that alien tactical doctrine would have left undefended. The indigenous being's surprise at encountering armed resistance from an unexpected angle gave Jake the split second he needed to place an accurate shot that sent the creature retreating with obvious injury. They're regrouping, Lissa reported. I can sense their confusion, they understood how to fight your teammates, but you're using methods they've never encountered. Good. Keep monitoring their emotional patterns while I... Jake paused as more creatures appeared at multiple approach points, their coordination suggesting they were implementing a complex assault plan designed to overwhelm any single defender. That was when Lissa surprised him. Instead of maintaining her passive observation role, she moved to a position that provided her with optimal telepathic range while staying within the protective perimeter Jake had established. Jake, I can sense their attack coordination, they're using some kind of empathic communication network to maintain tactical unity. Can you disrupt it? I can try. But it means I'll have to project aggressive thoughts instead of passive observation. Her pale green eyes met his, carrying determination that her peaceful species had probably never needed to develop. I've never used telepathy as a weapon before. Then don't think of it as a weapon, Jake suggested while preparing for the next wave of attacks. Think of it as protection. They're threatening someone under my protection, which makes them a problem that needs solving. Lissa nodded, settling into a meditative stance that allowed her to focus her telepathic abilities with unprecedented intensity. When the creatures began their coordinated assault, they encountered something their tactical planning had never anticipated, a telepathic specialist actively disrupting their empathic coordination while a human defender used adaptive tactics that had no precedent in their observational database. Jake's protection of Lissa transformed from standard defensive action into something that resembled choreographed cooperation between two beings who understood each other's capabilities well enough to create tactical advantages that neither could achieve alone. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since the attacks began, Jake felt like they had a chance of surviving until reinforcements could reach their position. "Jake," Lissa said during a brief lull in the assault, "they're calling for additional forces." "A lot of additional forces." "How many is a lot?" "Enough that they think it will take overwhelming numbers to counter whatever we're doing to disrupt their tactical plans." Jake checked his ammunition and equipment reserves, running calculations that suggested they could maintain their current defensive effectiveness for perhaps another hour before attrition made their position untenable. "Well," he said, maintaining the calm emotional state that helped Lissa function under stress, "I guess we'll find out if human stubbornness is as effective as alien military superiority when it comes to protecting someone who chose to trust us over beings that are supposedly better qualified for the job." The second wave arrived with the kind of overwhelming force that would have destroyed any conventional defensive position, but Jake had spent the brief respite doing something that no alien military doctrine would have considered. He turned their entire defensive perimeter into an improvised weapon system that used the environment itself as ammunition. "Incoming, 40-plus contacts from multiple vectors," Lissa reported, her telepathic senses detecting the massive coordination effort the creatures were using to ensure his destruction. "Jake, they're not just trying to eliminate us, they're studying your defensive methods to develop countermeasures for future encounters with humans." "Then let's make sure they learn some lessons they won't forget," Jake replied, activating the trap systems he'd spent precious minutes preparing during the lull. What the creatures encountered wasn't defensive positions designed to repel assault. It was environmental chaos that turned their own tactical precision against them. Rockslides triggered by precisely placed charges sent tons of debris cascading through their approach routes. Reflected solar radiation concentrated through improvised lens arrays created temporary but devastating energy weapons that required no ammunition. Sound waves generated by modified communication equipment disrupted their empathic coordination in frequency ranges that caused obvious physical distress. "They're panicking," Lissa observed with amazement. Their tactical plans assumed they would encounter defensive responses they could predict and counter. This is completely outside their experience. Jake was already moving to his next improvised position, using the chaos he'd created to maintain mobility while keeping Lissa within his protective perimeter. Humans evolved as persistence hunters on a death world where everything was trying to kill us. We learned to be creative about survival because being conventional meant being dead. The creatures adapted faster than he'd hoped, but their adaptation required abandoning the precise tactical coordination that had made them so effective against his alien teammates. As they shifted to more chaotic assault patterns, they lost the empathic synchronization that had allowed them to execute complex maneuvers. "Jake, I'm detecting something unusual in their communication patterns," Lissa said, her telepathic abilities picking up emotional signatures that seemed different from the attackers. "There are other minds out there, observers who aren't participating in the assault. Command structure. Maybe. Or. Jake, I think some of them are here to witness rather than attack. They're evaluating how you fight when someone you're protecting is in actual danger." Jake processed this information while using his sidearm to discourage a creature that had gotten too close to their modified defensive perimeter. "They're testing human protective instincts under combat stress. It feels like an assessment. They studied your teammates' combat capabilities, but they want to understand what drives human behavior when conventional tactics fail. Then let's give them a demonstration they'll remember," Jake said, implementing the final phase of his defensive strategy, one that required abandoning safe positions in favor of aggressive protection tactics that prioritized Lissa's survival over his own. He moved forward from their defensive position, using improvised weapons and environmental advantages to create a mobile protective barrier that kept threats away from Lissa while maintaining freedom of movement. It was tactically insane by alien military standards, but it was fundamentally human. The willingness to accept greater personal risk to ensure someone else's safety. "Jake, what are you doing?" Lissa called, maintaining her telepathic disruption of their attackers' coordination while moving to support his advance. I'm showing them what happens when humans decide someone is worth protecting, Jake replied, using a combination of projectile weapons, improvised explosives, and environmental manipulation to clear a path through creatures that had expected him to maintain static defensive positions. The creature's response revealed just how thoroughly they'd studied alien military doctrine. They immediately adapted to counter his aggressive advance using tactics specifically designed to neutralize Vorthack warrior charges and Ground Knight heavy assault techniques. But Jake wasn't following alien assault patterns, he was improvising moment by moment, using human adaptability to create tactical solutions that had no precedent in their observational database. When projectile weapons proved insufficient, he switched to improvised chemical attacks using materials from their communications equipment. When creatures adapted to his mobility patterns, he changed to methods that prioritized unpredictability over efficiency. When they tried to isolate him from Lissa, he demonstrated the human capacity for creative violence that turned anything within reach into a potential weapon. The observers are reacting, Lissa reported, her telepathic senses detecting intense interest from the non-combatant minds. Jake, I think they understand now why you volunteered to protect me despite what the others said about human limitations. Because size and strength don't matter when someone you care about is in danger. Because humans don't fight to win, you fight to protect. And there's a difference that changes everything about how combat develops. Jake's protection of Lissa had evolved beyond standard military engagement into something that resembled controlled fury channeled through tactical intelligence. He wasn't trying to defeat superior numbers, he was making it clear that any creature that wanted to reach Lissa would have to overcome levels of human determination that their species had never encountered. The turning point came when Lissa's telepathic abilities, enhanced by the stress of combat and her growing trust in Jake's protective capabilities, allowed her to establish actual communication with the observer minds rather than just detecting their presence. "Jake, stop," she called suddenly. "They want to talk." He paused his advance, maintaining defensive readiness while keeping multiple threats under surveillance. "Talk about what?" "About why a human half their size is successfully protecting an Etherian telepath from creatures that defeated warriors much larger and stronger than you are." The attacking creatures began withdrawing to positions that maintained observation capability without immediate threat potential. Jake kept his weapons ready but allowed the tactical situation to shift from active combat to tense negotiation. "Tell them," Jake said, "that humans learned a long time ago that being small doesn't mean being weak, and being afraid doesn't mean being helpless." Lissa's telepathic communication with the observers continued for several minutes, during which Jake maintained protective overwatch while processing the implications of first contact that had developed through combat rather than diplomacy. "They want to know," Lissa finally said, "if all humans fight this way when protecting someone they care about." "Tell them that depends on whether the person they're protecting is worth fighting for," Jake replied. "But in my experience, most humans will go to extraordinary lengths to keep safe the people who trust them with their lives. And they want to know if you would have fought this hard to protect any Etherian, or specifically me." Jake considered the question while studying creatures that had demonstrated tactical intelligence sophisticated enough to counter multiple alien military doctrines. "Tell them that I would fight to protect any innocent person under my care. But fighting to protect someone who chose to trust me personally, someone who saw past my physical limitations to recognize my commitment to her safety, that's the kind of motivation that makes humans capable of things that look impossible from the outside." The telepathic exchange continued, with Lissa serving as translator for a conversation that was reshaping how an entire indigenous species understood human capabilities and motivations. "Jake," she said finally, "they're withdrawing. Not just from our position, from the entire engagement with our unit. They've learned what they wanted to know about how different species respond to crisis situations." "And what did they learn?" "That alien warriors fight to demonstrate superiority, but humans fight to protect what matters to them. And that makes humans more dangerous than any physical enhancement could achieve." Over the next hour, reports from the main base confirmed that the indigenous creatures had ended their assault on all positions, apparently satisfied with their tactical assessment of interspecies military capabilities. Jake and Lissa were extracted to the main base, where his alien teammates waited with expressions that suggested their understanding of human protective instincts had undergone significant revision. "Morrison," Sergeant Kozak said as Jake and Lissa rejoined the unit, "I owe you an apology. And an admission that Vorthak warrior training doesn't include lessons on protecting people who trust you with their lives rather than their tactical assessment of your combat effectiveness." Lieutenant Vex Harmonix carried what Jake recognized as Zephyrian respect. "Your defensive methods were unconventional, but effective in ways that our enhanced capabilities could not match. Because," Corporal Drax added with characteristic Gromnite directness, "we were trained to fight enemies, but you were protecting family." Jake looked at Lissa, whose pale green eyes reflected an understanding that had developed through shared danger and mutual trust. "She's not family," he said quietly. "But she chose to trust me when everyone else thought I was inadequate for the job. That made protecting her worth whatever it cost." "And that," Lissa said, her telepathic abilities detecting the complex emotional honesty in his response, "is why I ran to you instead of toward the larger, stronger warriors when the real danger came. Because protection isn't about who's physically capable of winning fights, it's about who you trust to value your safety above their own." Colonel Thorne reviewed the after-action reports with the kind of thorough analysis that would probably influence interspecies military doctrine for decades. "Morrison, your protection protocols will be studied and adapted for future diplomatic security assignments." "Sir, with respect," Jake replied, "human protective instincts can't be programmed into training manuals. They develop when someone decides that another person's welfare is more important than their own safety or reputation." "Understood. But the tactical innovations you demonstrated. The environmental manipulation, the adaptive improvisation, the willingness to abandon safe positions in favor of aggressive protection, those can be taught." Jake nodded, though he suspected that what had really made the difference wasn't his tactical innovations but his emotional commitment to ensuring that Lissa remained safe regardless of the cost to himself. 6 months later, Jake found himself assigned to a new posting with significantly enhanced authority over diplomatic protection protocols. But more importantly, he found himself working alongside Lissa on assignments that required the kind of human-Etherian cooperation they'd developed under fire. "Any regrets?" Lissa asked as they prepared for their next mission, establishing communication with a species that had proven resistant to conventional diplomatic approaches. "About proving that humans can protect people who trust them." Jake checked his equipment with the careful efficiency that had kept them both alive when superior alien warriors had been overwhelmed by enemies they didn't understand. "The only regret I have is that it took a combat situation to make everyone understand that protection isn't about being the strongest person in the room, it's about being the person who cares most about keeping someone safe. Your teammates don't laugh anymore when you volunteer for protection duty." "No," Jake agreed, watching Lissa prepare her telepathic communication equipment with the kind of calm confidence that came from knowing someone would be watching her back regardless of the odds. "But that's because they finally understand what I meant when I said I'd protect you. It wasn't about my combat capabilities, it was about my commitment to making sure that someone who trusted me would never regret that choice. And now." Jake smiled, studying mission parameters that would put them in contact with another species that human adaptability might be uniquely qualified to understand. "Now they know that when humans say we'll protect someone, we mean we'll find a way to keep them safe even if it requires doing things that military doctrine says are impossible. Because that's what you do for people who matter to you."